Okay, so we are recording. We should have some more people filtering in, but as people filter in, I want us to be able to go ahead and get started. You can feel free to drop into the chat, just like Mabel did. Thank you. What part of the world you're joining us from, what's your favorite kind of story, who are some of your favorite characters in books, shows, or movies. So oftentimes it's a little easier to get into this topic of our own stories by thinking first about other stories we like or don't like, and what we like about them or not. I am with you, Mabel. I'm really liking stories with strong female leads. I also was a big fan of those characters from Little Women and Anne of Green Gables. So yeah, going like having to dredge them out of the dusty annals of my memory, but totally with you on that. Probably my most recent favorite read with a strong and quirky female character is a book called The Husbands by, I think the author's name is Holly Graziano, but it's a very quirky, interesting read where a woman discovers she has a magic attic, and every time her then boyfriend or husband goes up the stairs into it, gets swapped out for a different one. And it's a very interesting exploration of sort of the road not taken.
Yeah, I enjoyed that one too. Such a unique story, frame to work in.
Yeah, a really unique story for sure. The story with the underdog who rises against adversity and ends up succeeding against all odds. Yes, who doesn't love a good underdog story? I love those too, Arlette. Thank you for sharing that. That's great. Well, a little bit of background on me for those who don't know it. I want to make sure that I am admitting people. Yep. Okay, great. So welcome. Hi, please feel free to drop into the chat your answers of where you're joining from, what's your favorite kind of story, and who are some of your favorite characters. So my background, why I'm talking about this today, I'm a recovering former professor and also former nonprofit executive in each of those spaces for about a decade apiece. And one of the things that I really noticed most held back both myself as a neurospicy individual and a lot of the neurospicy students and employees and other managers that I worked with was that they couldn't learn or move in the direction of their goals because they had these pre-existing stories about what they could do, what they were capable of, how their brains worked, that stopped them from discovering what things would actually work for them. And so that's why we're getting into this topic today, and that's a little bit of my background in it and why I found it to be so important. Please feel free to keep dropping anything in the chat that you want to. But for a bit of context, this is kind of like a, precursor, almost think of it as like a prerequisite to a course that I offer on Maven called Spicy Brains Get Stuff Done. And again, it's because that we have to fix our baseline stories first before we can learn new strategies that help us with things like procrastination, distractibility, attention, things like that. Oh, I love the protagonist in that book too. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Victoria. So this is where all this is sort of coming from, leading into, if you have any interest, there'll be a chance to ask questions at the end. The recording will be on Maven, so at the same link where you RSVP'd, that link will also be where you can access the recording. And that it should be up there. I'll upload it later this afternoon, so it should be up there by tomorrow at the latest. So what are some of the common stories that I have heard from myself, my neurospicy family, my neurospicy employees, clients, students, all that good stuff? There's three that I've observed are the most common and variations of them, right? The first is, I'm not good at normal stuff. Put normal in quotes on purpose. You can probably imagine why, right? But the kind of like, why can't I focus, avoid procrastinating, pay attention, manage my time? What's wrong with me? I'm not good at these things. The second related one is, I can't do that, right? So the way my brain works means I just can't reach my goals. I'm not going to be able to. I need to shrink what it is that I'm capable of doing or what I'm pursuing because I'm not going to be able to because of how my brain works. And the third is, I annoy other people, right? That one's really common, especially for those of us that can identify, whether formally diagnosed or not, with elements of ADHD. It tends to really go hand in hand with I annoy other people. I know I annoy other people. I can see all the evidence of how I annoy other people. And that tends to kind of pull us in and shrink us from being able to take on new strategies. So why does having these stories, besides just the fact that they don't feel very good to have them, why does it matter for us to think about the stories themselves and not just try to tackle the particular challenges like procrastination or paying attention or time management? It's because the stories shape what we are able to see and do, right? So the first thing is we all as humans have confirmation bias. And what that means is basically our brains are trying to protect us from any kind of stress. And a big stressor to us is the feeling of being wrong. Being wrong actually creates more cognitive dissonance than being sad, than feeling alone, something like that, right? And so we would actually rather, from our sort of like brain's perspective, our mind's perspective, to protect us, be right that we annoy people and we won't be able to fit in with them, than be wrong about that and find connection. And so really tackling first at that base level, like, what is it that I'm currently believing? I need to shift that in order to allow me to see and have different experiences is actually really crucial, because otherwise that confirmation bias we have is always working against us. You can think of it as a Venn diagram, right? If one circle is all of the evidence and all of the experiences and all the things happening out in the world, and the other circle is our beliefs about ourselves and the world. It's only in the overlap that is the stuff that we see. So we only see the things that hit at the overlap between our beliefs and all the stuff that's happening. And it means we're missing out on all the other things that don't already match what we believe. The second important reason to pay attention to our stories is that they have a big influence on the level of motivation we feel. So especially for neurospicy folks, but really for anybody, motivation has ups and downs. But it's particularly common for neurospicy folks to hit these like high bursts of urgency driven, kind of panic driven, or novelty driven motivation, or when it's like fits in with something where we really like the person we're doing it for, and then hit these really low troughs where we just feel completely apathetic and like we don't want to do anything. If we want more like lasting motivation that's a little more even keeled, one of the core things we need to pay attention to is our sense of competence, our ability that we can do what it is that we want to do, or that we're able to learn what we need to learn to reach our goals. And if we're telling ourselves a story tacitly or out loud that I can't do that, I can't learn the things I need to, or I can't do the things I need to reach my goals, it's going to be impossible to have that sustainable motivation. We'll just hit those peaks when there's an urgent deadline and suddenly we scramble. And finally, the third thing is it's worth paying attention to, because anything that we repeat forms these kind of like synaptical grooves, right? So you may have heard the expression, what's fired together wires together. All the different neurons in our brain are leaping and connecting in different ways. But when we continuously link certain memories to certain beliefs about those memories over and over again, those synaptical pathways are much stronger. They're much more likely to keep firing. So it's worth paying attention to. So given all of that, what can we do about it? Right? To tell a new story, it does not work. I'm going to date myself here a little bit, but it does not work to do the like SNL sketch Stuart Smalley thing of repeating an affirmation like, I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and gosh darn it, people like me. Like that doesn't work. Just telling yourself an empty alternate story that really you're like, I know that's not true, ain't going to cut it, right? That's not going to shift the storytelling that you want. What you can do is first stop to take apart your current story. And we'll have a little bit of space to do this at the end of our session today if you want to do it out loud in a group, or you can do it on your own. But really pause and look at what is the current story I'm telling, and where are there cracks in it? Where might there be a little bit of evidence? If I'm telling myself, well, I annoy other people, can I think of any time that somebody complimented me precisely because I was kind of energetic and bouncing around and really creative, which are common strengths associated with certain kinds of neurospiciness, right? Can I find any cracks in that story? If we don't find the cracks first, if we don't start taking the puzzle pieces apart, and we just try to lay something else over the top of it, it won't work. We have to disassemble the first one a bit, see that there's something not quite right about it in order for that confirmation bias to start to crack through and not be always eagerly looking for evidence of our rightness. Once we've done that, then we want to explore a new possibility. So what's an affirming story that feels in reach, right? Again, this is not that I'm just going to tell myself the opposite of what I was telling myself before. That's not likely to work. What is more likely to work is if you can find something that's proximal, but more affirming. And then you almost think of it as like, I'm taking steps towards a different set of stories about myself. I'll give an example of a way that I did this in just a moment. Finally, the next piece in my cheesy T.E.L.L acronym here is to look for new evidence, right? So it won't work if we just go, I think it's possible I could believe this new kind of more affirming story. Cool, I'll just say that to myself sometimes. Again, that kind of empty repetition of affirmations doesn't work. It's not particularly good at like brainwashing ourselves, essentially. We actually need to find evidence to attach to that story. So again, if you think of that Venn diagram overlap, we need to deliberately find some things to put in the overlap so that we strengthen our belief in that new story so that it gets stickier. We can do that both by looking back in our memory to try to recall things that maybe we weren't thinking about before. But most importantly, we want to do it going forward. How can I set up new situations or set up the ability to look for something that I didn't previously notice? One of the examples that one of my clients gave when she was thinking about this is she was like, okay, what I'm going to do is I don't yet feel comfortable asking people. She had a strong imposter syndrome story. She's like, I don't yet feel comfortable asking people directly, hey, what are some ways where my expertise has been really valuable for you? But I could, over the course of the next week or two, just start to notice, hey, when I'm in conversations with people, when I'm in these collaborative workspaces, where is somebody nodding or smiling or saying, that's a good point, or appreciating an addition that I made? And let me deliberately like jot those down and track them so that I can kind of look together and go, wait a second, my in the moment expertise was useful. It did contribute. This can help me start to build up evidence to that new story. And then finally, the second L is for leveling up the new story, right? So crucially, like in that example that I was just sharing, she needed to then re-examine the new story in the light of the new evidence. So after she'd spent a week or two noticing those things, gathering that, we then talked about it and said, okay, what is it that you're seeing? And she actually ended up revising the story a little bit more of like, okay, it's that I'm very much learning oriented, right? I have learned all these things that are bringing a certain degree of expertise, but also I love continuing to learn new things. And that's not imposter syndrome. That's me recognizing I don't know all the things yet because I love always being at my growth edge and learning new things. And so it's okay for me to be in spaces where I'm contributing some expertise and I'm contributing some curiosity. And so that was the further evolution of that story for her. As an example from me, so one of my neurospicy specific stories is that I have really high sensory sensitivities as part of the way that my neurospicy brain works. So I'm really triggered by loud noises, strong smells, bright lights. All those things are likely to kind of send me into an overwhelmed, grouchy distractibility spiral and frequently also give me a migraine. The story that I had about all of this, which is just factually true, is, oh my gosh, I'm so weak, I'm fragile, I'm not as resilient as my friends and family, I'm such a drag to all of them because I can't do some of the like fun, more boisterous activities they want to do. And so that was what I constantly noticed, was all the ways that I was like a no in the lives of my friends and family. When I started to look for the cracks in that, I started noticing like, well, wait a second, there are times that I have been able to do stuff. And also there are times when precisely because I have those sensory sensitivities, I notice and I'm able to offer a different kind of support than someone who maybe didn't have those sensitivities. And so that then fed into exploring that new possibility, right? Well, what are their assets actually to my sensitivity? And I started looking for, are there any examples I can find where because I'm sensitive to these very small visual cues and very small auditory cues, that I'm noticing and picking up on things and therefore able to help solve problems more quickly than other people who maybe aren't as sensitive. And I found a bunch of examples once I started looking with that lens, and it allowed me to start to craft this new story of like, what if I think of my brain as more of a scalpel than a hammer? And metaphors can be particularly powerful ways to help us recreate a story, because what that allowed me to do was go, wait a second, both hammers and scalpels are valuable tools, but nobody would be happy with a surgeon who showed up in the operating room with a rusty hammer, and nobody would be happy with a contractor who showed up with a scalpel if they were supposed to be hanging a bunch of pictures on the wall, right? The tools are meant for different things. A hammer is meant for bludgeoning things because you need that level of force, and a scalpel is meant for more delicate, fine cutting. You don't get mad at the scalpel if it gets rusty if you leave it out in the rain, and you don't try to use the scalpel to drive a nail into the wall. And if I can think of my brain as functioning more like a scalpel than a hammer, I can appreciate both the scalpel elements of my brain, the hammer elements of other people's brains, and be glad that we can all complement each other in different things. I then started looking for new evidence of that, right? So I started to pay attention. Where is it that because I'm really sensitive, I'm picking up on things? And one of the things that I noticed was that as a manager working with a group of employees after the COVID lockdown occurred and everybody was suddenly virtual, that I was able to pick up on, wait a second, they're putting on a brave face and they're trying to solve through, but this is actually really stressful. There were moments where I was then able to intervene, provide a different kind of support. And as a result, my employee engagement scores stayed higher than those of other managers in my organization during that same time period when it came time to do our big employee engagement biannual review. And finally, that then helped me level up the story, right? So I had to pause and go, what still doesn't feel quite true about this? Is it still limiting in some way that I don't like? Do I need to revise the story further? Do I need to find more evidence so that it sticks, right? And so some of the ways that I did that was to notice, okay, well, there's some circumstances or times where I can handle something where there's a bit more sensory extremity. What's true about those times? What do I need to notice about how I have to take care of myself if I want to be able to sometimes do something like go to a concert or do some other thing that before I would just been like, I can't do that. And oh gosh, it's because I'm so terrible and I'm so weak and I'm so fragile, right? It became like, okay, well, I could go to the concert if I get earplugs and if I think mindfully about where the seats are and if I make sure that I get plenty of rest, kind of before and after, because I know I'm going to need to recharge because that's going to be intense for me. So like I mentioned, I have a course starting soon. I just wanted to give a little more detail on that for anybody who wanted it. You can build your personalized toolbox for procrastination, focus, decision-making, maintaining motivation, and more. If you scan this QR code, it'll take you straight to the registration where there's a 10% discount, or you can also just use the code StorySpice. The cohorts begin every few months. The next one is starting June 3rd. And basically, it's a 6 to 7 week long experience. This next cohort is 7 weeks because there'll be a pause for reflection week in the middle, where there's focused learning, support for brains that work differently. That takes the form of 6 workshops that are live, where I lead with content like this, and then we take time to build experiments and figure out what's going on so that we can create the tools that really work for people. And then 6 optional Q&As that happen on Fridays, where people who want additional accountability, they want additional support with hurdles, they want to celebrate something, or they just want to do some body doubling, where they can just come in and say, this is what I'm going to get done this hour, go on video and audio mute, and then check in again at the end and say, this is what I got done, because it helps them get stuff done. If you're interested in that and you're like, ooh, I could really do with a scholarship to that, you also can go to my link tree, and there's a link to a giveaway entry form. I will be giving away 1 full scholarship to people who fill out that form. So please check that out if that's of interest to you. So with that in mind, now it is your turn. You can raise your hand and type your questions in the chat. You can follow up with me later if you want to via email. You can also check out the resources on the Spicy Brains course page, but this is your time. What would you like to know more about? What story would you like to revise? What questions do you have that I can help you answer? And it's also totally fine to just, you don't have to raise hands, but to just come off of mute and jump into the room space.
Becca, could you talk just a little bit more about like what you go through in the course with decision making? I find that to be one area I really struggle with.
Yeah, we just went through decision making. It's very fresh to my mind because we just went through the decision making section in my current cohort on Tuesday, actually. So great question, Mabel. So in decision making, what I've found is really common across different kinds of neurospicy brains for different reasons, right? So the reasons look different for people who struggle with anxiety versus ADHD versus autistic individuals. But there is a common shared struggle with getting frozen in decision making. And so there are 2 kinds of strategies, and then there's specific strategies within each, but at sort of the meta level, there's 2 different kinds of strategies that help, varying depending on what tends to interrupt your decision making is external factors versus internal factors. And then what structures can you try? And so basically when we tackle decision making, it's okay, here's a bit of the research around why the decision making is tricky. Which of those whys is resonating the most with you? Okay, given that, here's the kind of sub menu of strategies that best matches with that kind of why. Now let's get support picking one that you want to try and setting up an experiment to try for that week of like, how can I try that out, see if it works for me? How would I know if it was successful? And getting guidance and feedback on how to set that up for yourself. And then the chance to circle back in the Q&A or at the beginning of the following workshop on What did you learn? Do you need to make any tweaks? Did that work for you or not work for you? One of the big emphasis for me, not just with decision making, but across all of them, is that there's no one strategy that works for all people in any of these areas. And so it's really important to have that kind of meta structure of like, how am I going to make it light and easy to try things out and not have it be a big deal or a whole extra time consuming thing that I'm doing, so that I can find something to put in my custom toolbox that works for me. And so that I also have other ideas so that if in the future that one's not working for a certain situation, I can grab one of the other ones that I heard about and try that. Does that answer your question, or do you want more details?
No, that's helpful. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, so more of an observation. I also have sensory sensitivities. One challenge I've had with friends and families, they don't believe me, and it makes me feel like I'm dramatic and high maintenance. I can so relate to that. I imagine a similar feeling to those with chronic non-visible illness and pain. It wasn't until I took a sound test with them that they realized my auditory sensitivity is different from theirs. That's actually a really smart, and I'm really glad you brought that point up, Christy, because sometimes it is that we're like, no, my brain is actually working differently than yours. And yes, sometimes other people in our lives are like, but is it really? And so that's a really clever way to be able to actually have evidence that everyone can objectively look at, right? Okay, let's do this sound test together. What is it that you're hearing versus what I'm hearing, right? And now it kind of opens up the space to collectively tell a different story, which is a kind of like next level storytelling of like, our stories don't come from nowhere, right? They come from the communities we're in and the broader culture that we're in. And so how we engage other people in them is also really important. And I love that that example kind of gets at like a way that you help to create evidence to have everybody on the same page about the sensory sensitivity is real. Now, what can we do with, that information being the case? Did you find that it helped? Yes, exactly. Did you find that it then helped? Like, were you all able to approach doing things together in a different way once they had seen that different perspective and that different evidence?
I'll come off mute. I think what it was is just that, like, when I brought it up after that fact, they believed me.
Yeah.
If I would hear something that would bother me, I would tell them and they'd be like, okay, now I get why it bothers her.
Yeah. I remember it took my husband a bit of time to believe me about my like sensory sensitivities. And then at a certain point, it actually became this sort of like fun joke for us where he would be like, because he has almost no sense of smell, he would be like, okay, wait, you tell me, because you've got the bloodhound nose over here. Is there such and such thing, right? And it became like a chance for a little bit more playfulness instead of this like, really, do you smell more stuff? And I can't remember what it was. Something happened where like I smelled something, he couldn't smell it. And then an hour later, it became apparent that the actual source was there. And I can't remember now what it was because it happened so many years ago, but it was a similar experience to what you're talking about, Christy. Anybody else, any observations, questions? Is there a story that you want to talk through? If there is, and you're like, yeah, but I don't want to do it on the recording, you're welcome to say that, and we can stop the recording here for the people who, wanted the chance to be able to catch this and couldn't make this time and specifically asked to be recorded. But we could stop the recording and continue the conversation if anybody is in that boat of like, I'd like to talk something through, but I don't particularly want other people to watch that on a recording later.
I have a story. It's Arlette.
Yeah.
And yeah, if there's an option to stop the recording,
okay,
that will be great.
That's great. And that's what I will go ahead and do. So we'll stop the recording here for anybody who's watching it later. The suspense builds. No, you can always, if you're watching the recording. Oh, great. Let me answer that question first, Victoria, before I stop the recording. This is a great question about the difference between neurospicy and neurodivergent. Different people use the terms in different ways. To me, neurospicy and neurodivergent are synonyms, but I prefer the term neurospicy because of the same story element that we're talking about. It is more playful. It is more affirming. Neurodivergent is a like much more official kind of medicalized term that is tied to specific diagnoses. Neurospicy is a sort of community created term from people who have some of those different diagnoses saying, wait a second, this is how I feel like my brain's a bit spicy. I've also heard the term, and I love it, neurosparkly, by, another client was talking about how she likes this and has even a sticker of it because she's like, I actually don't like spicy food, so neurospicy doesn't stick for me, but I don't like neurodivergent. And then I found neurosparkly and I was like, oh, I love that. Yes, I feel like my brain is sparkly. It's kind of shiny. It glints a little brightly sometimes. And so that was much more resonant for her. So that's the way that I use it. I also have found that neurospicy tends to be a bit more approachable to people who are like, listen, I don't necessarily know if I have a formal diagnosis. All I know is the traditional ways of trying to get stuff done don't seem to work for me. And that might be because they did. And then I hit perimenopause and the hormones changed in my brain. And now I'm like, what? I can, like, the brain fog is real. What's going on? Right. So perimenopause can both exacerbate or even emulate some of the symptoms of ADHD in particular. Or because people have gone through, something else. So they're like, I experienced a major trauma and suddenly it shifted my ability to pay attention, to remember, to do other things like that. I don't have a formal diagnosis of ADHD, but I can relate to these things. My brain just feels a bit neurospicy, right? So I like that neurospicy is a more inclusive term. It allows people to kind of have a playful way of deciding how they want to describe themselves. And that's why I use it. Does that answer your question? I know that was kind of a long answer. Okay, great. All right, then I will go ahead and stop the recording so that